Bom dia a todos. Gostaríamos de pedir a atenção para a cerimônia do pêndulo.
Precisamos de 100 pessoas. 100 pessoas com o mesmo propósito. Vamos, ao mesmo tempo, apertar um botão que está instalado na lateral da mesa. Numa atitude conjunta, criaremos assim o que ainda não há: uma humanidade. Uma primeira, incompleta, imperfeita, magnífica humanidade. E o mundo encontrará o seu prumo. Já!
Gostaríamos de reforçar o aviso de que os fones estão à disposição de todos ao fundo da sala, canto direito. Ok. O BRICS Policy Center, Centro de Estudos e Pesquisas, BRICS Think Tanks por intermédio, é originado de parceria entre a cidade do Rio de Janeiro por intermédio do Instituto Pereira Passos e o Instituto de Relações Internacionais PUC-Rio. Gostaria de dar as boas-vindas ao workshop As Cidades BRICS e o desafio do desenvolvimento sustentável como atividade inicial da Cúpula dos Prefeitos. O evento proporcionará aos dirigentes das cidades e acadêmicos de países BRICS uma oportunidade valiosa para se debater em profundidade e compartilhar experiências sobre práticas adotadas em favor da sustentabilidade urbana. Apresentação dos participantes. Moderador, Pedro Cláudio Cunca, coordenador do Núcleo de Desenvolvimento Urbano e Sustentabilidade do BRICS Policy Center e professor do IRI PUC Rio. Carlos Alberto Muniz, vice-prefeito eleito da cidade do Rio de Janeiro e secretário de Meio Ambiente. Lucy Corkin, sul-africana, pesquisadora associada do Africa Asian Center, School of Oriental and African Studies, da University of London. Sitoli Mbanga, sul-africano, executivo-chefe da SA Cities Network, da qual faz parte no debate desde 2002. Payal Banerjee, indiana, professora assistente do Departamento de Sociologia da Smith College, Massachusetts, Estados Unidos. Vitória Panova, russa, professora da Moscow State University of International Relations. Chen Wing, chinesa, vice-diretora do Centro de Pesquisa sobre Desenvolvimento Sustentável da Academia Chinesa de Ciências Sociais. Passo a palavra agora ao senhor Cunca, por favor.
Bem, bom dia a todas e todos. É um prazer estarmos aqui para um tema tão relevante quanto a questão do desenvolvimento sustentável articulado ao tema das cidades, em particular das cidades das intensidades, que são as cidades BRICS. Sem maiores delongas, pela limitação do tempo e em função também de necessidade de estar em outro debate, nós vamos iniciar com a doutora Vitória Panova, por favor.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm very proud to be at this meeting. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak in front of this very distinguished audience and to talk on this very important issue. I initially had a PowerPoint, but I wouldn't use it now for the sake of time so that we can actually storm through. But in case you're interested in having, because I had a number of points, number of slides that would show their planning for the Moscow Mayor of how it was planning to do transport, housing, environmental services, trade within Moscow. So in case you're interested, please turn to Fabiano Melnichuk, who is from BRICS Policy Center, so he will be able to forward you and ask for this PowerPoint. So the Earth is a planet of big cities. If in early 19th century we had only about 3% of people living in the cities, the early 20th century brought us to about 15%, right? And then now at the turn of, like at the early 21st century, it's already half or even over the half of the total population living in the cities. And we actually, some experts predict that number of urban citizenships is bound to grow by the end of the 21st century 3 times and reach up to 3/4 of the total population of the world. There are somewhat different problems that countries of Europe and United States, for example, face in terms of urban planning, and the developing countries are facing. In developed countries, we now see up to 80 to 90% of people living in cities, while their growth of cities practically stopped now, while the biggest incoming of the population, urbanization, is now seen from the emerging and vibrantly developing countries of Africa, Latin America, of Asia. And so this is the most, like one of the most important issues now, the problem of megapolises, or because on the one hand it's a basis for their public labor, for growth of public labor productivity, right? But on the other hand, it's also a source of inequality and also ecological, environmental ill-being. So how do we manage it in terms of making our cities sustainable? In terms of Russia, Russian urban population was growing up to 90, like early 90s, to about 73.9%, and then together with the decline of the population total, because we had about 148 million people at the beginning, like 20 years ago, and now it's only, well, according to official statistics, it's around 143 million people. And in terms of urban planning, we had a number of people decreasing to 73% only, and slightly growing over the past couple of years. We have, I believe we have different problems to address in terms of urban city planning. And actually in Russian science there is a concept of group systems of populated places, where you would have to talk about interconnection between their big megapolises and their rural places, where the people live, based on their single transport infrastructure and their trade and services sector. Talking about Moscow, we've witnessed a considerable positive change on the one hand in terms of how public authorities deal with the development of Moscow. So first of all, I should say there was a huge step in terms of transparency. We now have a site where all their programs are being enlisted. Some of them, I would say, more PR actions than the real ones, but I will talk about it like a couple of minutes later. What I see is problematic in Moscow is that I believe today we all have reached the limit of extensive development of cities. Meanwhile, what they are doing in Moscow is exactly the same. So some of you might have known, probably if you're interested in this topic, that Moscow is planning to expand its territory further by 2.5% only, so it will increase its territory enormously. And, but people are not being informed about it. It's like they don't really know the pluses and minuses, so they more likely fear. There's no referendum among their either Muscovites or the people of the Moscow suburbs who are planned to be included in this new expanded territory. So instead of, I think Moscow as a total of Russia is witnessing, as one of my colleagues pointed, so probably over-centralization both on federal level and municipal level planning. So there's no way to do their, Moscow is their main city, and then the satellite towns around it that would actually be specialized, that would be more effective in my view. So in terms of transport, they say that it might solve the problem of traffic because Moscow traffic is enormous. You think you know what traffic is in here? I mean, in Moscow, getting from one part of the city to the other may take over 5 hours. So some people actually can sometimes be stuck in there for that much of the time and lose, and this is losing of productive time of their work. There's constant attention given to roads. So in my PowerPoint, there's what planned and what has been done in terms of building the new roads. But in reality, there's more construction going all the time in improper places, improper timing, and actually creating more traffic. So probably you can share in terms of, there is a need for cooperation in terms of how those problems can be dealt with among our countries, among our municipalities. So that's what we just discussed. So there should be more cooperation on their municipal level among our countries just to see if where our problems concur and how they can be solved. Although what I think is positive for Moscow is that we have this really great system of metro, like a subway. So it's much more diverse there, like more than a dozen of lines going all directions. So this is something that can be shared from the Moscow side of how they actually do the metro planning. In terms of sustainability of housing and public utilities, there are lots of claims of actually changes, repairs, and additional building of being done. But I think Moscow is very much behind in terms of smart buildings. So they're saying that all the buildings that were constructed in the 50s, for example, that were, you know, Russian climate is not like here. I love your winter here, but in Russia the winter is like 30 degrees Celsius below zero. It can go up to that. So we even have more needs to sustain our buildings in a smart way, and it's quite cold otherwise, but huge resources, huge energy is used for heating. Meanwhile, we still, lots of houses, they freeze. So for example, they promised they will do, and there's a plan that they will do this cover for the facades, and then, I don't know, is it corruption, is it what? But then there was, for example, one building on the street was done as promised, and then the rest were forgotten. So now they put it in the plans, and nothing actually happened. Positive thing on the other hand, in terms of sustainability, now not housing but public utilities, is that the e-government. So they introduced, although not all the retired people can use it, but still they are learning. And it's, I think in their prospect, it will be very good that there will be less paper used in terms of paying for public utility, paying for electricity, paying for gas, because now it's all on the internet, so we can actually do it. And they introduced their water counts, which also teaches people how to economize. We still don't have it with gas, but since I think the gas is the last thing that would go on count with our in the city. In terms of services, probably because I will try to conclude now. One last thing is that Moscow, I'm not sure about Rio, but Moscow is extremely diverse city in terms of the level of how much people earn and how much they have. Their average, because it was put on the side that in average there, over the past year, people had twice as many benefits from salaries as opposed to previous year. But in reality, over the past year also, the difference between the poorest people and their richest people grew 3 times just in Moscow. So even if you say that Moscow is richer than the other cities, or the population there is richer, it's not necessarily true, because the majority of rich families with their over 100 million properties, they actually live in Moscow, and that's the problem. So what is the end result? I would say that what we do have problems, sometimes they differ from what you come across, sometimes they are the same. So it is vital that we do have people cooperating on their not only expert level, not just academics coming, but on their officials level, municipal level. And so I would actually hope that if there are Russians here, Russian officials, they would forward it to the Russian municipal Moscow authority, St. Petersburg authority, that they have to be more open for international cooperation and exchange. Thank you.
Obrigado à doutora Vitória Panova, que está aqui também na qualidade de pesquisadora visitante no BRICS Policy Center, e que depois vai ter que se ausentar porque ela coordena uma mesa do Rio Centro. Bem, nós passamos a palavra agora ao nosso convidado sul-africano, executivo-chefe da SA Cities Network, o Dr. Chitole Mibanga. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm here speaking on behalf of the Mayor of Johannesburg, who was unable to join the meeting because of other engagements. He is also the chairperson of something called the South African Cities Network, which I am part and parcel of. I'm called a Chief Executive Officer, but I think that's just a title. The fact of the matter is that the South African Cities Network is a network. It's a knowledge sharing and information exchange network that was established by South Africa's 9 largest municipalities at the dawn of democracy. So it actually is the epitome of what South Africa is. There's huge pockets of poverty, but there's also huge pockets of wealth within these 9 largest municipalities. They represent no less than 70% of the economy, and it's about 60% of the population. And yet, it's less than 15% of the land space that South Africa is. So they're quite significant in many ways, as it were. I think what I've chosen to do, Chair, is to approach this topic of sustainable development from 2 angles. I mean, there's the international space, and I think the conference that we are discussing, or the conference that we are attending here, the Rio +20, is one of those international platforms. I mean, it's the type of space that it is very difficult for cities to find the space to maneuver and get their issues on the agenda. It's an international platform, after all. So the extent to which you find that the frameworks that will be agreed upon here really accommodate what the needs of the cities is, I think is going to be found wanting. I've been reading some of the texts, and it talks about human settlements and transportation, as if those are the only things that cities face. In our context, the second issue then, in our context is that we face a huge problem of a mismatch in intergovernmental relations. In the bulk of the continent in Africa, local governments do not have much of a say. And I think in the South African context in particular, it becomes a difficulty. Yes, the Constitution recognizes local government as an independent sphere of government. It's got its powers, but the actual practical day-to-day relations between national government, provincial government, and local government are very difficult. I mean, local government is seen as a very unimportant sphere of government. And I think that is an inheritance from the past, because the role of local government in the past was menial. It was about rubbish collection. It was not about driving development. So the new constitution allows that local government should be at the center of driving development. So effectively, you're talking about a sphere of government, that is local government, which is only 10 years old, because that was institutionalized as far back as the year 2000. So effectively, it's a sphere of government that is 10 years old, and it still has to find its feet against a democracy that is now approaching 20 years old. So the other two spheres of government have gone ahead and they have developed, and the local governments still has to find its own sphere, its own space, sorry. The third issue then, category of issues, I think for us is the local platform, which is the practical issues. How do we deal with this animal called sustainable development? It is a problem because we have a myriad of issues, a myriad of challenges to contend with. And I would like to categorize those three in our those myriads of problems into three types of things. Let me then state the first one. The first problem that we have is that we do not have the appropriate tools to think about sustainable development. I'm talking technical tools. I'm talking information. Remember that the apartheid system only held information for a certain group of people who were a minority, that's number one, but also who were rich and who were affirmed in many ways than not. So for the great number, for the greater majority of people, we do not have those figures. So we do not have good, by way of example, we do not have good urban indicators. We do not know what are the trends that have been taking place, so we have to do a lot of extrapolation. So the type of information that you have is information that exists only at a national level. If you have to disaggregate information and say what's happening at a ward level or at a community level, those are the types of tools that we have to still contend with. I'll tell you the other tool that we do not have. We do not have the type of tool that makes us understand better the interface between rural and urban development, or the interface or the interdependence between urban space and rural space. There's still a huge gap about how it is that we understand, to a point that if you look at the policy machinery, it talks a lot and very passionately about rural development, and it says very much little about urban development. It's almost like the one side of the coin exists, the other side of the coin does not exist. And that is a problem. And what we would want to know and learn from our sister countries that make up the BRICS is, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the rural-urban interface? So that's the first thing that we have as a problem. The second problem that we have at a local level is the inheritance that we've had. We have, I'm not sure there's music playing. Am I supposed to stand up and sing?
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
I think that there is a problem from other.
No, it's fine. The building is beautiful nonetheless.
There are technical limitations.
Okay, thank you. I think then, for us, the other problem that we have, the second set of issues which we want to learn from sister countries is, we have inherited what we've called the apartheid space, right? Highly inefficient, highly segregated. The planning for the past 100 years has been literally, you have suburbia, which is predominantly white, rich areas, and then you will have a central business district, and then you'll have industrial area, and then you will have a place for black poor people. So creating a buffer practically between your white folks on the one hand, white rich, and on the other hand, black poor communities. Now, part and parcel of what we're trying to do is to undo that space, try to break it into pieces and try to make it efficient. And it is a problem in the sense that we do not know how to go about doing it. So human settlements is a way in which we're trying to engage with this, trying to create better human settlements, because we also have done our own mistakes. In fact, we have perpetuated the apartheid space in many ways than not, despite constructing some 5 million houses in the last 10 years for poor people. Transport and mobility is a problem. And it's not as much of a problem as we have in Rio, but I think what we mean is that the type of public transportation system that you see doesn't facilitate for ease of movement of the citizenry from one end of the city to the other. So it is inefficient in that way. In fact, despite the fact that we are told that we hosted the World Cup 2010 very well, we suddenly now have, by default, the transport systems that we created for ease of movement during the World Cup are such that now they continue to be utilized and accessed only by those people that can afford. So the poor continue to be excluded and so for us is, how do we undo this? And then there is also the issue of land. Land use management, where huge pockets of strategic land are in private hands. In certain instances, they are in state-owned enterprises. They're not owned by the state. They're not owned by municipalities. So if you have to purchase those pockets of land in order that you undo the apartheid space, part and parcel of what you're going to do is to buy those pieces of land at a very expensive price, and then it becomes totally unaffordable. The last thing that perhaps I need to talk about in us attempting to deal with this issue of sustainable development is a pocket of things that we would want to call vulnerability. How do you finance new cities? I mean, for us, in the last 10 years, in fact, the last 18 years of democracy, the local government sphere has only had less than 10% of the total cake. So most of the money that is generated by the country gets to be spent at national level. Local government only has only had to contend with just under 10% of the total fiscus. How do we finance that? But also, how do you deal, of course, now with the new pressures that you have through your climate change and all of those sorts of things, including issues related to food insecurity, because there's a lot of food insecurity, which is not something that only local authorities can deal with. It becomes a national type of a problem. What am I saying in conclusion is that I've outlined these as issues that we would like to exchange information and knowledge about. But I think if you were to ask what should be the outcome of sustainable development, for us in South Africa, it should be about social transformation. If sustainable development does not lead to the total transformation of our society, then there's no point for it. Then it becomes another academic exercise, something that we engage with without clear, tangible results. Because if we have to develop and be competitive at international space, but also locally, we have to change and transform how our society is. Thanks very much.
Bem, já vai se conformando aí uma problemática para cooperação estratégica em termos de temas e questões de transparência, recursos, espacialidade. Bem, continuando nosso debate, eu passo para a doutora Lucy Corkin, pesquisadora associada do Africa Asia Center, the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London.
Hello. Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I am going to be speaking a little bit about sustainable development in the context of Cape Town, as a citizen of Cape Town. And a lot of the themes that I wanted to pick up on actually resonate very well with my compatriot, Mr. Sithole Mbanga. What is interesting about Cape Town, Cape Townians are incredibly proud of their city. I think there's a similar pride of the Cariocas with Rio de Janeiro. But Cape Town has attempted to style itself as what it calls an African leader in the field of sustainable development, and actually was the only African representative in the executive committee of the ICLEI, which is essentially, it's a global forum of local governments on the issue of sustainability, and has hosted the 2006 summit of this forum, and has tried to carve a space for sustainable development in an African context. Now, in many ways, Cape Town is not representative at all of the African context, and this speaks again to the huge level of inequalities and marginalization that does occur in South Africa, not just in Cape Town, but in other large municipalities as well. On paper, Cape Town has been incredibly active. We have a raft of different policies dating from about 2001 that treat certain different aspects that are considered important for the sustainable development of an urban space like Cape Town. So things like the energy report in terms of the sustainable use of energy issued in 2003. Importantly, green building regulations in 2009. But there are a series of policy documents that have been issued. And the most important one has been the Environmental Sustainability White Paper, that laid out a 5-year plan from 2009 to 2014 in terms of certain specific medium-term goals that the city had in terms of tackling this issue of sustainable development. Now, this sounds wonderful, but obviously there are a certain number of challenges that Cape Town faces. A lot of these are mirrored in what Mr. Mbanga has said, because Cape Town is a kind of microcosm of the kinds of challenges that South Africa as a whole faces. But a couple of the things that I wanted to point out is, first of all, public awareness. The first time I'd come across any of this documentation was on the Cape Town municipality website, but internet access in South Africa and in Cape Town is incredibly limited. So immediately this reduces the access of this kind of information to the citizenry as a whole. And in terms of broad-based public awareness programs on more accessible media, such as the radio or various sort of open-air campaigns that are more accessible to all the citizenry, are much less frequent. So if you hide it on a website, on the internet, there are only a very few number of people that will actually become socialized with these issues. Again, and this links to my first point, there are two academics from an institute on sustainable development based at Stellenbosch University who talk about this concept of the danger of leading towards what they call green urbanism, as opposed to livable urbanism. Green urbanism they conceptualize as this idea of, creating wonderful mechanisms that are highly expensive initially and highly technocratic in terms of creating a sort of superficial greenness to urban development, instead of actually creating livable, cost-effective solutions that actually can incorporate society as a whole into the concept of sustainable development. Cape Town, like most of South Africa, has huge inequalities, and there are a lot of people that are simply excluded from this debate of urban development, sustainable urban development, and what this actually means. How does this actually impact their lives? And how can they actually be incorporated into this debate? And this is a huge issue because in many cases it is more of a sort of elite debate as to how can we green our own lifestyle. And there isn't a more profound debate as to how South Africans as a whole can do this on various levels of socioeconomic development. And then the last one, which is much more much more of a practical point, basic things like access to clean energy, access to efficient and regulated public transport in Cape Town is a huge issue. About 95% of South Africa's energy comes from fossil fuels, which means that we're one of the top 20 dirty economies in the world. Now, the need to change to a more sort of clean energy development is a huge one, particularly with Cape Town, because about half of our energy needs are actually based on petroleum and petroleum imports. And this is obviously not sustainable, as everyone knows. And then secondly, transport. Transport, again, this is a legacy that we have of apartheid. Those that are in sort of the upper echelons of wealth will drive around in a car, whereas the more marginalized sectors of society and the poorer communities were kind of left to their own devices during apartheid. And so we have this organic transport system that sort of developed in the grey market. And now it's incredibly difficult to kind of unpack this legacy of trying to create more inclusive public transport systems and public service systems that are available to all Cape Townians as opposed to just the select few. To conclude, I thought it might be appropriate, given the series of mega events that Rio is going to be hosting in the next couple of years, to raise a couple of points in terms of what Cape Town learned as a host city for the FIFA World Cup in 2010. Now, as Mr. Mbangu said, it was recognized globally as a very successful World Cup, but on the local level of the cities, there were quite a number of challenges that the city itself actually faced. In terms of the positive aspects, there was a huge regeneration of the kinds of transport services that Cape Town had, and it had this sort of bus network that and a network from the airport into the city, which we didn't actually have that kind of public sort of transport system. The penetration as to who actually uses it is, of course, another debate. But there's also it's almost like there needs to be a parallel attempt to shift the mindset of Cape Townians, many of which are not used to actually using these services and these integrated services. Also, one of the problems is that Cape Town has this mandate for sustainable development, but when you're hosting a mega event that is a huge national issue, firstly, the city itself lost a lot of sovereignty to the agenda of FIFA. FIFA had certain specifications for what it wanted. They wanted the stadium to be put in a certain area, which was completely at odds with what Cape Town wanted to do, because they preferred to. The original plan was to put the stadium in an area that would hopefully benefit from the kind of urban development that would spring up around the stadium. But FIFA decided to put the stadium essentially in the lee of Table Mountain, so there was this beautiful view, but it was a logistical nightmare because it was on a peninsula. Trying to get enough logistical support to allow people to enter the stadium and leave it in a way that wouldn't leave people in a 3-hour traffic jam was a huge problem, and it was one that was arguably quite needless, because although what eventually happened followed the FIFA agenda, this was completely at odds with, for instance, the kind of sustainable urban development that Cape Town had envisioned in order to actually reap benefits from the World Cup years after the event had actually changed. And this speaks to the kinds of problems that Cape Town, the local government, had to face, not only with FIFA, but also in terms of the national government agenda, in terms of what they wanted to do to present to the world how they wanted to present the country. And so this also, the idea of, in an event such as FIFA, pretty much everything in terms of inputs is imported. And this is part of the contractual obligations of hosting an event like that. But again, it's completely at odds with the kind of sustainable development that Cape Town had a vision of. So I think I've in conclusion, I think that whereas Cape Town does have a vision and it does have all of these policy documents, often in practice there are huge problems with trying to implement an agenda such as this. This is in terms of the heritage that Cape Town has, in terms of the legacy of apartheid, but also in terms of the kinds of conflicts of agenda, not only with the national government, as Mr. Mbanga also mentioned, but also in terms of supranational bodies such as FIFA, when Cape Town tries to project itself into the international arena. Thank you very much.